John, tell me, spell your name for me.
JOHNHOWARD.
Is everything good? Right?
Yep, sounds.
We're right. Um, John, where are you from? What's your background? Where are you
I
from?
was born and raised in Alton, Illinois, a town about the size of Gastonia, which is on the Mississippi River, about 30 miles northeast of St. Louis, Missouri.
Where'd you go to school?
High school in Alton, college in UNC Charlotte, got a degree in architecture.
How would you define yourself? What are you? Somebody said, what are you? Are you a architect? Are you a plant? What are you? What are you, John?
I am a neighborhood activist who pushes good planning and good design to people who don't understand about urban design and planning. So I very much am supportive of neighborhood context and historic preservation. Whatever makes a community unique and great, that's what I try to push for and communicate to people who may not understand what that means.
Well, now, how did you get interested in this? Where did you develop this interest in the built environment? Where'd that come from?
It was kind of funny. I got in architecture because of the Brady Bunch. Mike Brady was an architect and lived in the Brady Bunch house. And a friend of mine and I said, we're going to be architects when we graduate and go to college. So I got into school, and I found out that I was much more interested in the built environment from a comprehensive perspective, not just in one building. So my best projects were always community-based and based on a broader idea of what makes a place rather than what makes a building great. And when I graduated, I never heard of planning until I got out of school. And I was trying to find a job and went downtown and scouted around and went to the government center and said, do you need somebody to help you with your graphics and your design work? And they said, sure, come on in. And there I met a guy named Warren Burgess, who was my first mentor and best mentor, who taught me all about community activism and good urban design principles. And from that point, I began my planning career. And that was back in the mid-90s.
Well, of course, I knew Warren very well. He was a great guy, and he was a great guy. No question about it. I have a very clear image of him. Well, you said you were a neighborhood activist. I think that's how you defined yourself.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, what do you think are the things that the built environment contributes, and the nature of the built environment contributes to making a neighborhood better?
Well, I tend to always like to think organically about a place. You can't always take what's new and great and replicate that somewhere else that doesn't fit. You got to take kind of what's there that's really good and make it better. And it starts with the people, of course, getting them engaged. And it starts with having a good set of bones, a good fabric, and starting from that point. And taking what's good and making it better, taking what's bad and making it better. Not necessarily tearing everything down, which you don't have to do. Sometimes you do have to do that. But how do you think intelligently about how you use your neighborhood assets in the best way possible?
Well, talk to me a little bit about how you think Charlotte is doing as far as being a place that's advancing those principles that you think are important.
I think in neighborhoods, they're doing a pretty good job. I think outside of Uptown, you see, your Myers Parks and your Wesley Heights and your Wilmores, all those great old neighborhoods that are really doing a good job in maintaining that old character and that old fabric, while also trying to introduce new housing and new buildings that kind of fit in contextually. There's been a few hiccups along the way, as you well know, but I think that outside of Uptown, that first kind of that urban core, the urban ring outside of Uptown, we've done a fairly good job off the main drag. When you start looking at the corridors, that's where you see all the strip development. We lost a lot of great buildings over the years, but somehow the neighborhoods behind it have stayed intact. And that's what we're trying really to focus on, is how can we keep those neighborhoods intact from architectural standpoint and from urban design standpoint. And eventually people will come back and reinvest and rebuild, fix up the old homes. And then the corridor will start to come back after that. So I think Charlotte has done a fairly decent job in terms of looking after the corridor design piece. The neighborhood piece is more about the people who live there. at that point, city government kind of can't do a whole lot. You can't make people go and invest in certain places, but you have to kind of allow people to do what they need to do to reinvest.
You said there have been some hiccups. What are some of the hiccups?
I think in the 1960s, when zoning was allowed to happen in Charlotte, you've had the stripped out corridor development along like South Boulevard. You see all the strip commercial centers where all the buildings are pushed back, all the parking lots are in front. We lost that urban traditional form that kind of made that pedestrian realm really great and kind of framed the street. Now you've got seas of asphalt, you've got more car-oriented type development, not really conducive for pedestrian movement. No more mixed uses. You don't see the multi-story buildings as much as you used to. You don't see people walking the streets as much as you used to. People go from block to block driving when they should be walking. So I think that from the 60s to the 80s, we kind of lost that urban mentality. And now we're starting to put that back into our zoning codes and to our thinking of how do we make great places.
Well, now, you grew up in Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
In the town that you grew up in, did you say it was Alton, Illinois?
Alton, yes.
You said it was about the size of Gastonia.
Mm-hmm.
How many African Americans live in Alton, Illinois? What would the percentage of population in Alton, Illinois be African American?
I think back when I lived there, it's about 30%. 30% African American, probably 65% Caucasian, and 5% other.
Well, now, what's it like working as a neighborhood activist in a southern city? I mean, does that present some special challenges and some special opportunities?
It does. I had the pleasure of working with affluent neighborhoods and not so affluent. I worked in Myers Park on a tree replacement project, and you kind of feel a sense of comfortableness when you see a younger, black male who's telling folk how to plant their trees. Something that very simple. So there's one kind of feeling there. And then when I go to a not so affluent neighborhood where you've got more people who look like you, there's still an air of distrust in terms of now your government coming in trying to tell us what to do with our property. You've already moved us from one place in the 1960s through urban renewal, and now you're here trying to help us. So I'm kind of caught in the middle in both instances. One, you're an outsider coming in, and we don't know who you are. And two, you're an outsider coming here, we don't know who you are, and we don't trust you. So it takes time to build trust. That's been the hardest thing, I think, being here, is letting people know that you are on their side, and you're not trying to do something dishonest or behind the scenes to hurt them. So it took me a long time to figure out how to really make those bonds. It takes patience and communication, and lots of doing good work, just doing the great things.
Do you think that a community is better for having a sense of heritage, regardless of what community it is? Do you think that a sense of heritage makes for a better community and for a better neighborhood?
Yes, I think it does, because it gives something to build upon. If you've got a foundation that's you're the first community to have the first integrated school, that's something to kind of be proud of. And how do you build upon that? And how do you kind of use that to communicate to your community that we do have a history of integration and have a history of belonging. We don't want to separate. We want to bring people in and encourage people to talk to each other and not to be afraid of each other. That's one of the biggest, I think, issues that we've got, is people are kind of afraid to share their individual thoughts and to think that we're all different. We're not so much different. We have a lot of things in common. Everybody wants stable housing. Everybody wants great places to shop. We all want good schools. So I think that we have a lot more similarities than differences.
Well, what do you think, what in Charlotte do you think is separating people?
It could be fear of the unknown. It could be I'd rather be with somebody I know that I can identify with. It could be class. A funny thing here is when I used to ride the bus a lot to and from work. And I rode number 10, the West Boulevard bus. And I would get on wearing something like this, or maybe a little bit less. And people would look at me and wouldn't sit next to me, usually. because they felt like I was somebody that they weren't familiar with. Could be a cop. I could be someone that they just didn't know. And it took a while for them to say, all right, he's okay. We trust him. So even in my own community, I had those kinds of levels of distrust in terms of, who are you? You're not from here. You're not one of us. You don't look like us. So that could be the biggest, I think, dividing point of people's comfort level is, I don't know you. You don't look like me. So therefore, I'm going to separate you and go my different direction.
One of the people that had an enormous impact on me was a preservationist from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, whose name was Arthur Ziegler.
Mm-hmm.
And we brought him to Charlotte back. Doing okay?
Yeah.
Everything okay? Everything okay?
Okay, I
Bob?
just wanted to make that a little neater. You
Okay.
slip down on me when I walk.
Picky,
Absolutely.
Picky. Good God Almighty!
I need to look
Man,
as good as.
yeah, yeah. Fastidious. You live in South Carolina too, don't you? Can't, anyway.
There he goes again.
I'm always getting out about that. We had Arthur Ziegler here in the late 1970s. He walked down McDowell Street and looked across Marshall Park.
Mm-hmm.
He said that was the most sterile space he had ever seen in an American city. What would be your reaction to the view across Marshall Park?
We know Marshall Park sits in the government district, where you have a courthouse on one side, you've got the government center right up the street from it, you've got a huge church that's only occupied twice a week right behind it, and the CMS building, well, the former CMS building is right behind it, and a big parking lot. So it's not the most park-like setting that you want to be in, because it's only activated during the weekdays from 9 to 5. And it's not the most happy environment because people are going to court. Most people going to court aren't very happy. So it is a sterile environment from a aesthetic standpoint. It doesn't feel like a natural park. It feels very unnatural. I think because one of its setting, and two, its design and use. Weekends, there's nobody down there at all. It's kind of just by itself, kind of a wasted open space.
But one of the most dominant images of Charlotte that you see on postcards, I heard Richard Michelle told me, he used to write for The Observer. He said that Charlotte aspires to be Gotham on the Catawba. Now, what's your reaction to that?
I hope we aspire to be that way. I hope that we don't. I think that a lot of the 1970s kind of urban thinking is really prevalent in Charlotte. Uptown, you have a lot of buildings that were designed to not address the street. They were built to be internal. I think that comes across all throughout downtown. And I think now there's a big effort to get people back onto the street. Epicenter is a great example. The Hearst Tower is a great example. You got open spaces that engage people and don't separate people. So putting the right open spaces in the right places and getting people back into the built environment is very important. I think Marshall Park is a great space. I just think that where it is, it's unfortunate. We've got a dead building here during the week. You got a dead building on the other side on the weekends. And there's no users of the park, and it feels sterile because of what's around it.
Well, I get the impression that you're more enthusiastic about the neighborhoods on the inner ring around the city than you are the actual urban core. I mean, am I wrong?
Well, the urban core will be what it will be. I'm not worried about the urban core. There are plenty of people who are going to invest money downtown. We've got good plans in place that will make sure that the parks will be built, that the great pedestrian uses will be built. So I'm not too concerned about what will happen uptown. The money will be there. I think the neighborhoods, around uptown are most important because they are your gateway coming into the city from all the major thoroughfares, Beatties Ford, South Boulevard, Independence, Monroe Road, Central Avenue. Those are where you really feel the life of the city. When you drive through those corridors, you see many different things and many different people. So I think that you have a great opportunity there to really impact how Charlotte looks to the people who are commuting from Huntersville or from Pineville or from out of state or from the airport coming in. That's their first interaction, is the neighborhoods and the corridors, not downtown necessarily.
Well, now that you're talking about neighborhoods, let's start talking about Biddleville.
Okay.
Tell me about your assessment of the current status of that neighborhood. Don't worry about what's going to happen or what might happen, but you know, you said you're a neighborhood activist, and you're someone who likes to see people on the street, and you like to see storefront shops, and you like to see a sense of diversity and acceptance and all that stuff. Tell me about how would you size up Biddleville right now?
Biddleville is an interesting place because, you know, during the real estate boom in 05, 04, you had folks coming in from all over, New York, California. We got phone calls every week, or I did at least, about speculating real estate deals. People flipping land, buying land for $80,000 for a single family lot. It really got kind of crazy. And I was afraid that Biddleville would be lost in terms of its real natural core. But I was surprised by neighborhood folk who said, you know what, we want to protect our place. Older folk now, and younger. There's a unique character here that we need to protect. How do we do it? And I'm very happy about my relationship with Biddleville, the people there and the leaders like Charles Jones, who have been there for years and who have been staunch preservation advocates about that place. I think that it's got different pieces to it. You've got one side that's right near uptown that's got a relatively new housing authority apartment complex. Rumor is it might go away someday, and that's probably what's going to happen. Behind it is a great old neighborhood, a little pocket of really cool, you know, 1910s, 1920s Victorians and bungalows. That's kind of by itself, really quaint, right by the university. Then you've got, 9 landmarks, all in walking distance of that campus and on the campus. What a great opportunity to grab onto that history and say that this is a valuable asset. Let's renovate these buildings. Let's make it a tourist attraction. Let's really make this a truly great village right on the heels of uptown. So I think the potential is there to make it a really cool place, a real destination for outsiders coming and say, how do we merge the new and old? How do we knit that together?
Well,
that's the challenge.
Let me be a little bit of a cynic here.
Okay.
How are you going to overcome that Interstate 77 moat? I mean, that thing is just this colossal. I mean, how are you going to overcome that? How are you going to get a sense that Biddleville is connected to the center city or to the rest of Charlotte? How are you going to overcome that I-77 moat?
It's a moat. It's a big one. And there are moats all over town, all over uptown. I think the same way where you saw Dilworth take advantage in South End of that reconstruction of 77, you gotta let people somehow feel comfortable walking and driving to and from that place. I think the underpass is very daunting. At nighttime, you don't want to walk down there. It's dark, it's noisy, it's not very nice, it's not very clean. Thank goodness for Dr. Carter at JCSU, Johnson C. Smith University, who has invested money to make that underpass not as daunting. So this winter there'll be a project to actually light up that underpass through a public art project and to get the state to clean up the north and south end of that Trade Street bridge. That will be a start. That'll be the first thing to do, is to make that underpass not so uninviting, if you will. But then there's perception. You can make it as pretty as you want to. You can pretty it up as all you want. You can put $1 million into it and make it as nice as a gateway as you want to. The perception still will be, this is uptown and that's the west side. So it's going to take time to actually bridge that different gap, which is, forget about 77. It's all about what people think is across the bridge. So when they start seeing development happen on Trade Street, they start seeing the Mosaic Village come up off the ground, the mixed-use dormitory that JCSU is building, and start seeing new development along West Trade Street, that will help change perception, but people have long memories. Even black folk who have grown up here and lived here, they hear, oh, the west side is bad. Well, guess what? They're not going to even give it a second thought to go over there. So the assumption and perceptions are really more of a barrier to me than the bridge.
in this sense of bridging this moat, tell
Mhm.
me about your attitude about the idea of a streetcar. You know, there's this idea that we know the streetcar is going to be built on the east side up to Presbyterian Hospital.
Mhm.
That's a done deal. That's
Mhm.
going to happen.
Yes.
How important do you think, or how significant do you feel it would be to extend the streetcar to Biddleville from the center city?
I think it'd be a grand gesture. Streetcars historically have been, well, recently have been thought of as being economic development catalysts. If you have rails in the ground, that means money will come. There's a permanence to having a rail system, not a bus system. And trains are sexier. People like streetcars, and people like light rail. Buses don't have that same, that same feel. The rubber tire system is great. It's efficient. It can move around traffic. But when people, see a streetcar, they feel like this is a worthwhile investment. There's a lot of money that goes into it. And this is a whole different feeling about riding on a trolley or a streetcar than riding on a bus. So I think that there's a feeling that the investment will come behind the streetcar. And it's time for the West Trade Corridor to have that kind of investment activity to lure people to come and invest and build new buildings and build the mixed-use urban development that we're all looking for. And I think that there's a sense of permanence and pride associated with having that investment come to your community.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Biddleville in terms of threats of gentrification. Gentrification is a big, big issue. I remember in Charleston, South Carolina, when I went there, I'm an old man, when I went there in the late 1940s, virtually, except for the houses right on the Battery, it was all African American people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they're gone. They aren't there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's for the most. Is Biddleville two things? First of all, if these things happen, if you light up the underpass and you get the streetcar and you start to change perception and da-da, is there a sense, is Biddleville in danger of being lost by gentrification? What do we mean by preservation? Do we mean preserving the built environment? Or do we mean preserving what Biddleville has been, which is, let's face it, initially because of the strictures of racial segregation, legal racial segregation, it has been an African American community.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think gentrification, what's the threat there, do you think?
That was really a big issue, again, back in 2004 and 5, when the real estate market really kicked up and was increasing property values 50, 100%. But some feel that some level of gentrification is not as bad because it does bring investment. So I think there's a fine line between how much is too much. Do you lose it all to gain a little? Or how do you actually balance that combination of bringing in new investment and not lose all of your older folk who have been there, been through the struggle. They've lived there through all the the down times and through all the crime, and now they're seeing property values increase. Should they be pushed out because now they've put their time in and their investment in? Is it fair for them to leave? I don't think it is. So I think that there's that conversation of how do you make it fair for people who have been there all these years, and now the threat that they're going to have to leave and move out of their homes and leave their community and leave their friends and their family. That's a very real threat, and I think that people are still thinking about it, not so much now as a few years ago, but I think there's a different conversation going. Like, how can we balance growth and still maintain the soul and the character of what Biddleville really is? I mean, Wellesley Heights used to be an all white neighborhood, and Biddleville as well. Well, in some parts of it. So there's that feeling, but there's that feeling of we stayed here through the hard times, and we're not going to give it up. So you're going to have that kind of conversation. It needs to be had, quite frankly. But I think that it's not as bad as it is. Well, what it could have been. Um, there are ways to keep people in their homes if you have a certain income called, I think it's called a tax abatement or some kind of tax reduction. If you're a certain age or have a certain income below a certain level, you can keep your home without having the threat of your taxes increase and you lose your home. So there are ways for some people to stay. But I think that the new thought is, let's bring in the new development. Let's bring in students to live around campus. Let's have the university invest more in the housing structure so we can start to build up the residential base. Because people will age on. So when they age on, then what happens? If the family doesn't want the home, then somebody else will. So we got to be realistic about what gentrification really means. Is it really that bad? Or how should we actually look at growth when it comes to race and class? I think that we're still trying to have that conversation on a different level. I'm not quite sure we're all there yet. But I'm not for wholesale, we're going to come in and buy everybody out and kick everybody out and bring in a whole new set of people. That's not the right way to build a community. It has to happen over time, a little bit more naturally.
Well, now let's focus some more on the future of Biddleville. In terms of perception, in terms of building an image for Biddleville, how important do you think telling the history of the neighborhood is in that perception?
I think it's vital, actually. I think because of the presence of the campus of Johnson C. Smith University, that's where the story starts, because the neighborhood sprang from that university. I think that if people don't understand the value that is there, that they won't respect it, and things will happen that are not respectful. I've seen new housing go in that completely is devoid of any contextual architectural design. It completely throws off the whole character of a street and of a block. That's because people don't understand what this community means. They're coming from out of state or across the country, coming in with their own idea about housing and about development without understanding the current fabric and the history that made it what it is today. So I think that it's of utmost importance to know where the community came from, how it got developed, who developed it, and why. And then you got to have a conversation of how do we move forward from this point? What is the right kind of growth? What is the right kind of infill development? That kind of, not to say it has to match everything. You don't have to rebuild Victorians in 2012 to look like something in 1912 or 1892. It needs to be good modern development without being overly disrespectful to the character of the neighborhood. And that's not that hard to do. I've seen some great infill housing built. I've seen some very bad infill housing built. It's just a matter of how conscious the person is of that historic timeline.
You think Biddleville ought to become a local historic district?
We did do a windshield tour years ago, and I think parts of it can be. I think parts of it can be, and parts of it probably should be, based on, I guess, the letter of the law in terms of what an HDC or historic district is. Maybe it doesn't qualify based on the number of historic structures or historic period structures already intact, those that have not been altered beyond a certain point. There's a line there. I think it needs to have some kind of historic protection, whether it's a historic district or a conservation district or a national district. I think it has to have some kind of recognition. You've got 9 landmarks, which is great, but it can go one more level up, I think. I think it's worth having a conversation again right now.
How do you feel about the commitment of Ronald Carter to Biddleville? What's your assessment of his role and his vision?
Well, what he's doing now is largely based on what happened before with Dr. Yancey, who raised a lot of money to do what he's doing today. So kudos to her and what she did. She didn't have quite the same vision as Dr. Carter in terms of getting off campus and developing property and building bookstores off campus, building a mixed-use building off campus, building a performing arts center off campus, leasing buildings, forming partnerships with developers to get this stuff going. He's got, I think, the urban vision that needs to happen at this time. It's great timing, I think, for the city. Every so often you get these kinds of urban thinking presidents of universities. Doesn't happen every time, but once every cycle you might get one or two that come in and really understand how to merge an urban campus with the surrounding community. And you got to be careful though. It's a whole town and gown concept of where you've got the existing town and existing community who may not want a lot of 18, 19-year-old kids running around all day partying. So there's always that kind of friction sometimes. But so far, he's been able to really communicate very effectively with the community and show that he's very committed to doing what's right and to make it a village again. Right now, you kind of have two different parts. You got the campus as one entity, and you've got Biddleville as a separate entity. He's trying to bridge those two back together again, the way it used to be when the campus was first built. And I commend him greatly for all of his work. He's on the streetcar steering committee. He's very much behind getting that ran up to John C. Smith. He's on every public policy project that affects his area. So he's very involved for a president, and I'm very happy that he's here doing that kind of work.
Tell me how you feel about the Historic Landmarks Commission and Johnson C. Smith University joining together to initiate the restoration of the Davis House, and what you think that is that something that's significant or important? Give me your feelings about that.
I'll tell you, about, let's see, 7 years ago, there was a rezoning petition filed by the campus, by Dr. Yancey, to actually have those buildings torn down for a parking lot. They tore down 3 of them, which I think Dr. Davis actually built those 3 homes next to his primary home. And we did put up a fight, and we see who won. Obviously, the 3 homes were torn down. And I was very afraid that the Davis house would be gone. I'm surprised it stayed this long. I was praying that it would stay. I talked to Dr. Charles Jones about it, and we actually have talked about it before. From a small committee, how can we get this house preserved? I don't know how it actually stayed up that long, given that past leadership. The board was very much in favor of tearing it down, and somehow it stayed. I think when Dr. Carter came, he actually saw the potential. The dollars were very, very high in terms of renovating that house, and the argument was, well, should we just knock it down and rebuild a place cheaper, or is it worth it to go in and renovate it and find $800,000 to renovate it? That was a tough conversation to have, just from a business standpoint. Historically, it makes a lot of sense. You know, first black professor on campus on a very prominent corner. As you turn off, Trade Street, Beatties Ford Road onto Dixon Street, it's right there on the corner. The wraparound curved port. It's a great house in that neighborhood context. Great scale, great bones, just a great story. And to lose it would have been catastrophic to me. So I think that as a landmark, I'm very happy and excited that you all got involved, and Dr. Carter put the money and the time in to make sure that house is preserved. That to me made a very big statement for that community.
You used a very strong word, catastrophic. Why would it mean? Just look at it from a practical standpoint. You could tear it down. You could put up a new building. You could probably do it for cheaper. Why would it have been? What would you have lost if you had lost that house?
I think it would have sent a message that anything is dispensable. So it's not the fact that you lost the home, but that now people are saying, well, should the whole neighborhood be torn down? If you got an old house next door, well, let's just, in order to make that match, let's tear this house down and make it look nicer. I think it would have been a domino effect in a negative way. You lose a very prominent structure that needs to stay, not just based on its history, but based on its character. And then you start seeing other people saying, well, what about the Grand Theater? Well, what about Old Mount Carmel Church? What about these other landmarks? Should we look at all of them and consider tearing them all down and starting over again? I think that's real, to me, that was the real negative after effect, is that you're going to start a trend possibly in saying, let's let a building fall apart until it's in disrepair, and we'll just knock them all down. Then I think that starts that whole different conversation of, we've lost our neighborhood character. Biddleville is no longer what it used to be because we've lost so many important structures that remind us of who was here and why this neighborhood looks the way it does. If you lose those landmarks, then you've lost a lot of the soul of that community.
Two more things I want to ask you about. Are we okay on time?
Yeah, about 40 minutes.
Well, I'm going to ask you two things. In terms of African American heritage, you think there's too much emphasis placed on the civil rights movement?
I don't think so. I think that not enough is being placed, especially from the standpoint of our education of our children locally. I think we're having some background conversations about should we do more in our CMS education to make sure kids know about Fred Alexander and all the people who lived here, who helped build this community, who were in Second Ward, Brooklyn, and got moved out, and they still pioneered civil rights activities. What about H.L. McCrory? What about Washington Heights? All these great people who were here who developed these enclaves so that people could fight for civil rights and fight for good housing and fair housing. That conversation's gone. When you look at the school curriculum now, there's no mention about local Charlotte history in terms of social history and civil rights history. So I think that it needs to be talked about, but in a different way, maybe to a different set of people, or younger folk who are trying to move up in and out of school. There could be an opportunity there to really get that sense of community pride back into our young people so that they can actually stay where they live and be proud of where they live and not feel like, well, I'm on the west side, therefore who cares about what we do over here. You got to start somewhere and even rethink how you communicate that message. So I think that it needs to stay, but needs to be kind of repositioned a little differently. How we do it, I'm not sure, since CMS has its own rules governed by the state. It could be we have summer school classes. Maybe we partner with the Wise and the church to have extra credit classes. We take these courses during the summer or on weekends. You get extra credit. So it takes that kind of thinking, I guess, to get that kind of conversation going in a different way. But I think it needs to stay. It needs to be talked about more locally than it is than nationally.
Well, you know, if you expand the Biddleville, Beatties Ford Road corridor area a little bit more broadly than just the area around the university, you've got, obviously, in the immediate university area, you know, Dorothy Counts and all of that came. She was living in Biddleville. Her father was actually associated with Johnson C. Smith University. She walked or was driven down West Trade Street to what was then Harding High School. You've got, of course, the sit-ins in Charlotte were largely, not exclusively, but largely people by John C. Smith students. You mentioned, and you know, the homes of Jewish Chambers and the homes of Reginald Hawkins and the homes of Fred Alexander and the homes of, you know, Coleman Carey. I mean, the names can go on and on. They're all in that area. So do you think that the revitalization of that Beatties Ford Road, Biddleville area should indeed pay attention to those stories and those places that are there that reflect Charlotte's involvement in the civil rights movement?
I think you're exactly right. I think that we do have a role in telling that story. How we do it is, I guess, a different conversation, but we can do it in different ways. Down in Cherry, in the Cherry neighborhood, they've got the new bus shelters that have the images displayed on them of different residents and kind of the history of the Cherry neighborhood. As well as on Wilkinson Boulevard, you've got the Camp Green images about what that neighborhood means to that section of Wilkinson Boulevard. So I think we have to be creative about how you tell the story. It can be a sign on a pole sign stuck in somebody's yard saying this is where Julius Chambers grew up, or a house was bombed. Or we can have actual other types of way to communicate the importance of these people to these places. It's just a matter of how we do it. It's a matter of where do we put these types of elements. I think as far as a public sector employee, we try to get these things out into the public realm to where people can actually appreciate it and read about it and embrace it. I think we're doing that more now than we used to. So I think there's a different thought now in terms of how do we communicate the role of people in places. Speaking of Fred Alexander, we actually did a project off of Rawson's Ferry, the Fred D. Alexander Boulevard Bridge, where we had 2 columns put in. I called his family. I called his niece, I believe, and she had pictures of her father and some comments by him. So we took those and we replicated the pictures onto a plaque and put those plaques on those columns, along with quotes by Dr. King and some other people. So that's one way we can always communicate back, this is what this means. Those are small efforts, but still I think it's worth noting that we're going to try to invest our time to think creatively about how do we communicate the importance of these people to these places.
Do you have anything else you want to say that I hadn't asked you? Have you got any thoughts about this general topic? It's been fascinating talking with you, but do you have any broader thoughts?
Yeah, in terms of West Trade and Beatties Ford Road, I've had probably the best time of my life, of my professional life, working in that corridor. Meeting people like Maddie Marshall, who really kind of took me under her wing and said, I want you to help me make my neighborhood better. And the timing was great. I came at a great time in my planning career to kind of be left alone to do what I needed to do as far as make great communities better. And I think the level of trust that I built has been very important in my career as well. To be able to build bridges and to not build walls, to be very candid in talking to people and not just being a talking head. I think I've made some pretty good progress with folk in building trust between neighborhoods and government. Because when Brooklyn was taken away and torn down, a lot of people really felt really offended by that. Obviously, you took their homes away, and now you got moved to Beatties Ford Road, away from the community. So I think that there's still that air of resentment in government or toward government. So as far as trying to build that bridge, I'm glad that I had the chance to at least understand those stories and take those back to people where I work and say, look, this is where this angst comes from. You got to be patient. You have to learn how to build trust again. So that's kind of my parting shot. Is I've had a great time working in planning. I don't work there now anymore, but I still maintain those kind of relationships with my colleagues and with the community.
Why do you care so much?
Great question. Most planners don't do it for the money, obviously. We do it because there's a greater good. I think that planners should know all about where they live. And I just happen to have had the great honor again to work with Warren Burgess, who shared with me his passion for community. And I never really lived in the suburbs. I've always kind of lived in the inner city, in these kinds of neighborhoods where they aren't always have the nicest things. I never lived in South Park or any other kind of affluent neighborhood. But I like a community with character. I like character. I like soul. Not soul being all black or anything like that. I like having a place with attitude. And I think that there's not enough of that in Charlotte. I think we could have a lot more other places that have that kind of soul and character, like Plaza Midwood, You go to Plaza Midwood, and you go up and down the shops, they're all eclectic. It's a great hodgepodge of different things. You can find anything you want just about between 3 blocks of Central Avenue, between Morningside Drive going down to Hawthorne Lane. You can find everything you want within that stretch. That's the kind of stuff that I like. It's a
How
great.
about NoDa? How do you like NoDa?
NoDa's good. I think the arts part of NoDa is kind of going away and becoming more like a bar scene, not so much an art scene. And you kind of figured out it was going to happen through, again, gentrification and through just people getting priced out, and even the changing of how art is sold now. And they have more online galleries, not so much people occupying a space. So I think that NoDa is going through a transition on its own of being less about the arts from a art standpoint and more about entertainment and entertainment venues like neighborhood theater, more bands, more local bands.
How big a factor in being a person that tries to plan is race? Is it still a really big deal?
I think it is. I think the best example may have been the Ballantyne case that came out this year, the affordable housing case, where they tried to build the units down somewhere in Ballantyne off 51. And there was a big uproar about that. People said in public, it's not about race, but behind the scenes you hear stories about, oh yeah, it really is. And I'm kind of a pessimist on that end, where I have a greater hope for people, but right now it's not there. I think that between race and class, it's still going to be a big divide. And unfortunately, we can't spread affordable housing across the city like we would like to have an even share of South Charlotte having their fair share of affordable housing as far as, as well as West Charlotte. So I think race comes into play, not overtly, but kind of like behind, in the back of your mind, you think that things are going to happen based on either perception or reality of people's thoughts about race and class, people being like each other, and people being afraid of who is not like you. I think that's still kind of prevalent.
One thing I'd like to see in Middleville is I'd like to see some statues.
Of?
Fred Alexander'd be fine. I'm very struck by the Hugh McManaway statue on Queens Road.
Mm-hmm.
Even though a lot of people don't know who Hugh McManaway was, they decorate him, they put wedding gowns on him, they put flags in his hands.
Right.
And to me, that speaks much more than monumental parallelograms.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. Right, I understand.
Would you think putting some statues up in Middleville would be a good idea?
I think it could be. I think in the right places, because people don't know who these people are who laid this foundation. And I think that's another great way to say, let's pay homage and never forget who helped get us to where we are. I think that's a good idea. I think it's a great idea.
Anything else? Have you said all you want to say?
Probably not, but that's all I can think of right now.
Anybody else got anything you'd like for me to ask?
Yeah, I'd throw out one question and just look right
Okay.
over at Dr. Morrow when you
Okay.
give the answer. And you sort of alluded to this, John, when you talked about sort of the perception of the West Side. And that I've been doing neighborhood work. I've been here in public health for almost 20 years, working in things like health disparities and doing neighborhood work. And I hear that a lot, how the media portrays the West Side.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could kind of sum up really the whole discussion of what you just talked about, of how history and preservation of these, these great people and everything, that there are riches that are involved in that we could actually, that the community does need to hear about and needs to be proud of. So if you try that for me and just look right over at Dr. Morrow.
Well, I'm going to throw myself on a personal side into this conversation of perception. I live in Revolution Park, which is right outside of Wilmore. Revolution Golf Course. It was founded by a guy who's, I think his father or grandfather fought in the Civil War. He's a general way back when. Osmond Barringer is his name. So I did my research on him. Even though the history wasn't all that great from a racial standpoint, it's still important to know where you are. And I think that it's important for people to really understand, again, how things happen, how things became the way they are, so that then you can make changes necessary in your own mind to figure out, well, should I stay, or should I try to make improvements where I live? What will trigger people's interest in getting more involved civically? And I think that's where this conversation can really help. How can you get people engaged in their own community? It has to be on a local level, a very local level. It can't be too broad. So you can find ways to get people engaged in their neighborhood level and then kind of go out. That's a good place to start. And we all have stories. Every neighborhood has some kind of story. I don't care where you are in Charlotte. So how do you get those stories out in the open and have a dialogue about it? I think that's the biggest challenge. So we can figure out that part out. We got it made. But it's kind of hard for some. If you don't have an advocate who is going to put the time in and put the work in, it's going to be a hard toe to row. But you know, it can happen. It can happen.
Good.